on the platform, honorable members of Standing Committee on Appropriations on Finance, Select Committee on Appropriations Finance. Good morning, and also greet the chairs of those committees, Honorable Maswangai, Karim, and Honorable Dikeledi. You are all welcome. Let me also welcome the Minister of Finance, Honorable Kotowan, Deputy Minister of Finance, Honorable Masondo, Acting DG, Momo, and the whole National Treasury family on the platform. The chairs and all members of the committees from the provinces who are joining us on for this meeting, you are welcome. The MECs responsible for financing the provinces on the platform, again, good afternoon. Support staff of our committees and members of the media, everybody who's on the platform, as I've said, you are all welcome. Thank you very much. Today, we are interacting with the Minister of Finance and his team about the midterm budget policy statement that he presented yesterday. This will give us an opportunity to interact, ask questions, have our views on a number of things that he pronounced on yesterday. With those few opening remarks, so as I said, the meeting will be chaired by myself, by Honorable Maswangai, Honorable Karim, and Honorable Mashangu. Let's see. Do we have any apologies? Let me start with the select committees. Baban.
Thank you, Chairperson. Chairperson, we don't have any apologies, Chair. We have the full complement of the committees. We have also invited the provincial portfolio committees on finance, the chairpersons and the members, and also our colleagues. Thank you, Chair.
Yes, thank you.
Chairperson.
Yes, sir.
It's you.
Honorable Ms. Karim.
Yeah, just a quick thing. Luval was right about the presence, but we should have sent you a note, Chair, to explain that for some inexplicable reason beyond our control, the NCOP has decided to put the FIC amendment bills on the agenda before 3 o'clock today. This has never happened before, but I think it's a glitch in the programming side. But unfortunately, we'll have to leave. See, it depends on how long the motions and all, the usual thing takes. But the estimate is that we have to be in the House, those of us who are physically here, at 2:45. So I suspect about 2:40 or so, some of us will break off. I regret that, but that's beyond our control. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Karim. I think let's try and aim at 2:30. That we are done with this meeting. We'll try and control that. Thank you very much. Alan, any apologies from your side?
From the Standing Committee on Finance, no apologies, Chair.
Thank you. Darren, from your side?
Chairperson, Standing Committee on Appropriations, we received an apology from Ms. Dikhale. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll note those apologies. So what's going to happen now, we'll request the Minister of Finance to take us through the briefing and his team, and after he has done that, we'll allow questions and deliberations from the honorable members and everybody that is both from the national parliament and from the provincial parliaments. They're allowed to engage with the minister, and then we'll have announcements and close. Let's try to aim for 2:30 for the reasons that Honorable Karim has just shared with us. Thank you very much. Honorable Minister, congratulations with your medium-term budget policy statement yesterday. We are all yours. The time now, it's sort of 12:30. Let's give you up to maximum, up to 1:15. Honorable Minister, you are welcome.
Yeah, Thank you, Honorable Chair, and the other honorable chairs for other committees and honorable members of these committees. Let me say from start, I mean, I'm going to give Edgar Seshi to take the committee through our presentation, but I'll do some few remarks. One of the things we're trying to do in a difficult environment is to manage the trade-offs which are being thrown to us in this current environment. The first thing we're trying to do is that over the few years, we spend more money giving to state-owned enterprises and grants, and that undermining the baseline departments, the frontline services. In this medium-term budget policy, so starting from February, we've been trying to grapple with that question. For instance, that's why we've been able to give more money to provinces for teachers and so on. We have also employed this financial year 10,000 police. We intend employing 15,000 over the next few years. I'll come back to those trade-offs. So we're trying to shift away from that arrangement, but challenges still remain. These were challenges from state-owned enterprises which have got strategic importance in the economy and which make it difficult for us to work out from them in the current environment. But we're shifting the resources. We're beginning to implement, put more money on infrastructure, put more money on education, put more money on the police, put more money on to deal with these crime challenges. So broadly, that's where we're heading to. Were it not for the extension of the grant, would put more resources on those areas, but the extension of the grant has also imposed another trade-off and other trade-offs. What are those trade-offs? It includes, for instance, we're intending to put 30,000 police moving forward. Because of that trade-off, we had to reduce the number of police we're going to be employing in the next financial years to about 15,000. There are other trade-offs which we have done in other programs. What we have not done is to reduce the social services in this regard. I just wanted to make so that honorable members understand where we're heading to in terms of prioritization, infrastructure, social services, make sure that they're attended to. So both in them, you've got a growth element in investing more in infrastructure, but meeting basic needs of our people. So we're doing that balancing act, but I'll let Edgar to take you through the slides. All right? Or DG? Okay, acting DG. What do you want to do?
Yeah. No. Afternoon, honorable members, and thank you, Minister. Minister, can I just say that Edgar and I are here, and some members of our management have joined online, but some are busy on a roadshow, so they will not be able to join. So apologies for them, but they are going to try even as they take a break. So honorable members, I think just Edgar will go through the slide, but I just wanted to say that, I think that the good message out of the MTBPS yesterday is that South Africa is restoring its health on public finances. And we're doing so at a time when globally there's a real slowdown taking place. I went with the minister and the governor to the IMF World Bank annual meetings 2 weeks ago. And I must say, never have I seen such bleak projections of what's happening with high inflation, the impact of COVID-0 in China, what it's done to supply chains, and of course, the Russian-Ukrainian conflict that we've seen, and that's ongoing. So those are having a huge impact. And in fact, part of the shock was also what happened in the UK when they really, in effect, put an unfunded mini budget forward, and we saw the swift reaction of the markets. So in a sense, I think when you see the MTBPS and we didn't get the Liz Truss or Kwarteng response, I think it's a... Secondly, I think that, so the global risks, I think, are very significant, and we're going to have to take it into account, even the impact of interest rate rises in the US, in the UK, our trading partners, especially the US, is going to have an impact on many, many emerging economies. And, you know, I guess the message we had from overseas was we really have to put on our seat belts. It's going to be rough the next 6 months, and perhaps even rougher next year. So I think members must bear that in mind. I think that in this global environment, we probably have to be a bit more fiscally prudent than we would normally have been. But we've been helped by the fact that we've had higher than anticipated revenues, which has reduced the gross borrowing requirement and allowed us to prioritize key areas, spending priorities, what we call frontline services, but we mean health, education. We've extended the SRD for a year, and of course, policing and crime, which has been prioritized, and put more money into infrastructure so that the budget at least begins to have more of a growth orientation. And I think, Chair, just to point out that, you know, our fiscal consolidation has really helped us. It's put us on a good course, that our primary budget surplus is achieved next year, that we've stabilized that 2 years before we means that our revenue exceeds non-interest spending. We still have a budget deficit, so let's just be clear, because we have to pay debt servicing, but we're not borrowing to pay our interest in a sense, or totally. And I think that that helps to stabilize the debt. And even as we consider taking on ESCOM debt and so on, we're in a place where we can still stabilize the debt, but Edgar will go into these. So Chair, I'll stop there for now and just point out that we've been able to do so, not just in spite of the global shocks, but also the local shocks like you've had with the flood damage that took place in April. In fact, both the Russians going into Ukraine kind of was the day after the budget, and the flood was also the events that really shocked our fiscal framework in a big way. But Edgar, over to you.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Acting DG. Thank you, Minister, Deputy Minister, Chair, Honorable Chairpersons of the committees, and Honorable members. Let me move on here. Thank you. So as Acting DG and Minister indicated, the global economic outlook has become quite challenging as we look forward in and what's happening in the global economy. Global growth projections have been revised downwards, both for the current year and for next year. The war in Ukraine, as well as disruptions to energy supply in Europe, have created additional pressure in international supplies, as well as in respect of inflation. At the same time, we're seeing a slowdown in growth in China, and that obviously has a significant impact on demand for goods globally. And of course, the disruptions that happened as a result of COVID continue as a result of these things. As Momo was indicating, we have this very significant challenge of inflation that is eroding buying power, but it's also leading to central banks increasing interest rates to fight inflation around the world. And that, of course, means that the cost of borrowing is becoming more acute. So we consider that the risks from a global perspective are very much tilted to the downside. And what that means essentially is that we have to think of our fiscal decision-making from the perspective that there's more likely to be negative outcomes in the global economy than positive outcomes. Turning to the domestic economy, we have revised down as a result of both the global dynamics as well as certain domestic incidences, the estimates for growth in the current year. So at the time of the budget in February, we projected that growth would be 2.1% in real terms in the current year. Of course, since that time, we have had, as the acting DG was indicating, the conflict in the Ukraine. We have had massive flooding in various parts of the country, mostly in KwaZulu-Natal and Eastern Cape. We've also had industrial action, including most recently in Transnet. And of course, we have had very bad load shedding and poor electricity supply. We've therefore revised down the forecast for GDP growth in the current year to 1.9%. Next year, GDP is also forecast to be a relatively low 1.4%. In terms of the risks, we've already spoken to them to some extent, and Momo touched on them at length, but the risks to the global and domestic outlook remain elevated, and as I said, they're tilted to the downside. We've spoken to the conflict in the Ukraine. We've spoken to also the pace and scale of monetary policy tightening, where central banks are lifting interest rates to fight inflation, as well as the slowdown in the Chinese economy, the second largest economy in the world, which would have very significant implications for the economies of countries around the world. And of course, domestically, the issue of the power cuts, as well as the events that have taken place since that time. What we need to do in order to counter both these effects, as well as the lingering economic challenges that South Africa faces, is to accelerate the pace of economic reforms and structural reforms. And this remains very, very crucial in order for us to weather the storm. And as I said, to also deal with the fact that some of these things have been there for a number of years. Now, the first thing that's very important we consider is that we need a clear and stable macroeconomic framework, because this lays the foundation for a growing economy. As Momo indicated, the events, particularly in the UK, have shown the consequences of not sticking to a stable framework. And this includes maintaining a flexible exchange rate, ensuring low and stable inflation, in other words, price stability, predictability of prices to the extent that it is within our power to ensure that, and of course, sustainable fiscal policies that don't cause uncertainties and instability in markets and in the economy. In addition to this, we need rapid implementation of economic reforms to boost economic growth. In this regard, we should report to the committees that since the budget in February, progress has been made on a number of important reforms that are critical for supporting investment and job creation. First, in the electricity sector, the National Energy Crisis Committee has been set up, and this will focus on urgently improving the performance of power stations, as well as adding new generation capacity to the grid. We consider that enacted successfully, these efforts should be able to add around 14 gigawatts of electricity capacity over the next 2 years to South Africa's electricity supply. The second area of reform where we've seen progress is in transport, where the Transnet National Ports Authority has been corporatized, which is an important step in raising the competitiveness of South Africa's ports. Third-party access to the freight rail network is also being pursued, and private sector partnerships are being developed for the port infrastructure in Durban and in Ngqura. The white paper on the national rail policy was gazetted in May with a focus on measures to raise competitiveness, lower logistics costs, and encourage investment. The third area of reform is in telecommunications, where the auction of broadband spectrum has been completed, and other steps are being taken, including to facilitate the provision of electronic communications infrastructure at the local level. And finally, the visa reform, particularly the e-visa system, is now in place, and other reforms are being put in place within that the context of that reform process. In addition to this, honorable members, government plays an important role in ensuring that the overall regulatory environment and the provision of services is supportive of growth. And we'll come back to this during this presentation to indicate how government has sought to make injections that will promote economic growth and provide basic services, particularly to the poor and the most vulnerable in our society. So the medium-term fiscal strategy, given both the risks that we've outlined in the macroeconomic environment, both globally and domestically, as well as the need to address reforms, is as follows. The strategy prioritizes achieving fiscal sustainability by narrowing the budget deficit and stabilizing debt. This will assist in ensuring, among other things, that debt service costs do not crowd out critical service delivery as well as investments in the economy. Secondly, increasing spending on policy priorities such as safety and security and infrastructure in order to promote economic growth. And finally, reducing fiscal and economic risks, including through targeted support to key public entities and building fiscal buffers. Over the next 3 years, there will be spending increases, but they will be targeted towards supporting economic growth and the delivery of services in health, education, and local government free basic services. It's also important to indicate to honorable members that over the medium term, this budget prioritizes the social wage. In fact, 59.2% of consolidated non-interest spending goes to the social wage. In other words, this is public spending on health, this is education, housing, social protection, transport, as well as employment and local amenities. So that's 59%, almost 60% of the budget is going towards these items. We're also increasing infrastructure spending over the MTF. And in addition to that, in the current year, we are proposing conditional in-year allocations through a special appropriation to Denel, Sunral, and Transnet. And this will help to reduce the contingent liabilities and enable these entities to continue supporting the economy as well as national security in the case of Denel. Let's start by looking at the in-year, or rather the in-year revenue outlook for government. First, in the current financial year, revenue collections in the first half were 9% higher than at the same period last year. This is partly because of the positive impact of high commodity prices, although this is starting to dissipate. In fact, it has largely shown signs of dissipating, but there is a more broad-based increase in tax collections, particularly on corporate taxes. Compared to the 2022 budget, the gross tax revenue estimate for 2022-23 is projected to be higher by 83.5 billion rands. This includes having taken into account both the VAT refunds as well as the fuel levy collections that were somewhat below estimates because of the fuel levy relief that we provided earlier this year when fuel prices spiked.
And fortunately, they have started to come down since that time. On the expenditure side, again, focusing on the current financial year, we're proposing significant increases, and mainly this is to deal with the impact of the flood damage, particularly, as I've said, in KwaZulu-Natal and Eastern Cape. But we're also making proposals to increase funding for Northwest Province and Northwest Province, Western Cape and Northwest Province, which were also affected by disasters over the last year. Compared to the 2022 budget, government proposes a net addition of 37 billion rands compared to the budget. Now, there's a number of offsets in the numbers, and I won't go through all of the details, but suffice it to say that there are 54.1 billion rands in spending increases, but these are offset by declared unspent funds in other areas, as well as projected underspending and a drawdown in the contingency reserve. That's why on a net basis, it's 37 billion, which is shown in this table on the left-hand side. In addition to the in-year allocations in the Adjusted Appropriation Act, which, as I've indicated, are dominated by provisions because of the flood damage, we're also proposing a special appropriation bill, which will be comprised of 23.7 billion rands for SANRAL to pay down government guaranteed debt, 5.8 billion rands for Transnet, and also 3.4 billion rands for Denel. Turning to the medium term, starting with the revenue outlook over the medium term, in the current financial year, the revised estimates for revenue are a revenue collection of 1.68 trillion rands, as I've indicated, an upward adjustment of 83.5. Next year, we project that revenue collection will be 1.788 trillion. In 2024-25, 1.9 trillion. And in 25-26, revenue collections of 2 trillion rand, meaning a tax to GDP ratio of around 25%. Turning to the medium-term expenditure outlook, next year, main budget non-interest expenditure will increase by a net 52.4 billion rands. The following year, we propose net increases in non-interest expenditure of 58 billion rands compared to the 2022 budget. To break these numbers down, honorable members, this includes the following proposals over the next 2 years. We propose to add 66.9 billion rands for health, education, and the provision of free basic services by local government, and a 1-year extension of the COVID-19 Social Relief of Distress Grant. Second, we propose to add 8.9 billion rands for safety and security, including police, defense, and various institutions that deal with investigating crime and financial crimes as well as corruption, such as the National Prosecuting Authority, the Financial Intelligence Center, as well as the Special Investigation Unit, the SIU. Third, we propose to add 11.3 billion rands for infrastructure investment, including the rehabilitation of damaged municipal infrastructure and the refurbishment of provincial roads. These spending increases are funded by improvements in the revenue estimates, as well as a drawdown of the unallocated reserve that was tabled at the time of the 2022 budget. The unallocated and contingency reserves have helped to cushion the framework from fiscal risks that would materialize over the medium term. It is proposed that the unallocated reserve is increased by 11.3 billion rands in 2024-25 to 41.3. And it is also proposed that the contingency reserve, which has played a very significant role in providing funding for flood damage and other disasters, that this should also be increased by 2 billion rands over the next 2 years. Compared to the 2022 budget, the expenditure ceiling is increased by 51.7 billion in 23-24 and 57.8 billion in 24-25. All that being said, we have been able to make these injections without worsening the fiscal imbalances compared to where we were at the time of the budget. As indicated, because we had a combination of improved revenue estimates and a reserve that we set aside at the time of the February budget, we've been able to make provision for the spending while at the same time improving the fiscal balances. Therefore, government expects to achieve a primary budget surplus from the 2023-24 financial year. As you can see in this graph, it will be the first primary budget surplus in 15 years. And it is as a result of a combination of determined and disciplined budgeting supported by favorable revenue dynamics. Turning to the financing of government spending, which does not come from revenue, in other words, the borrowings. During 2022, the funding environment has become very difficult and is characterized by elevated risks, elevated risk aversion, and sharp increases in risk premium. Over the next 3 years, government will need to manage large redemptions which are spiking, reflected in the gross borrowing requirement, which has been revised down from 484.5 billion at the time of the budget to 411 billion in 2022-23, largely because of the decline in the fiscal deficit. Over the medium term, the gross borrowing requirement will still average around 445.7 billion rands, which puts the gross borrowing requirement over the medium term at a path that is around the pre-COVID levels. In other words, we've been able to moderate the growth in the gross borrowing requirements compared to where we've been over the last 2 years. Long-term borrowing in the domestic bond market will decline from 330.4 billion estimated in February to 299.4 billion in 2022-23 and will average 312.4 billion over the medium term. In 2022-23, government has raised around $3 billion in the foreign capital market and an additional $1.7 billion through concessional funding from international financial institutions to meet its foreign currency commitments. Meanwhile, a portion of the higher than expected revenue collection that we spoke to earlier will be used to increase the closing cash balances in 2022-23 and will be carried over to 23-24 to finance a portion of the gross borrowing requirement, which, as I've indicated, is going to remain above 400 billion rands. Turning to the debt outlook, gross loan debt is now expected to stabilize at 71.4% of GDP in the current financial year. This is mainly driven by the improvements in nominal GDP projections in the current year, resulting from higher inflation, but it's also mainly because of the improvements in the primary balance because of better than expected revenue estimates, coupled, of course, with discipline on the expenditure side. These factors outweigh the adverse impact of high interest rates and a weaker exchange rate at this time. And so the debt graph is beginning to peak. On a net basis, in other words, taking the gross debt and minusing the cash balances, debt will still stabilize at 69% of GDP in 2024-25. Turning to the expenditure priorities in summary, as we indicated, much of the budget, in fact, 59.2% of the budget is focused on the social wage. And if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, you can see that learning and culture, which is dominated by basic and higher education, more than 95% of it is basically education, will receive 1.4 trillion rands in funding over the medium term. We still have a challenge with debt service costs, which are still going to exceed 1 trillion rands over the next 3 years. However, social development which is dominated by the social grants, will receive over R1 trillion in funding over the next 3 years, followed by 825 for community development, 803 billion rands for health, 781 billion rands for economic development, as well as 708 billion rands for peace and security, which is mostly the police and national defense. If we look at the growth rates, which is on the right-hand side of this graph, you can see that the fastest growing item of spending over the next 3 years is going to be economic development, reflecting the injections that we're making to infrastructure in order to promote economic growth. However, aside from debt service costs, the second highest item of spending besides debt service costs is community development, which reflects the injections that we are proposing for free basic services, as well as other items to fund services to the poor and the most vulnerable in our country. Overall, consolidated government spending is projected to increase from 2.21 trillion rands in the current year to just under 2.5 trillion rands in 2025-26, growing at an annual rate of 4%. And as indicated, this of course is dominated by the social wage. The social wage can be summarized as outlined in this table. I'm not going to go through all of the details, but for all intents and purposes, the social wage refers to the combined spending on health, education, housing, social protection, transport, in other words, public transport, employment, and local amenities. It will total 3.56 trillion rands over the next 3 years and is, as I've indicated, by far the largest item in the budget. Turning to infrastructure, which receives, as I've indicated, very significant injections over the next 3 years to support economic growth. The spending on buildings and other fixed structures is projected to increase from 66.7 billion this year to 112.5 billion in 2025-26, which is an annual average increase of 19%. Now, buildings and other fixed structures refers to roads, bridges, water and storm water works in terms of public spending. And this will receive the fastest growing budgets over the next 3 years. To summarize the fiscal framework, as indicated, we project that revenue will exceed 2 trillion rands for the first time over the MTF. And the revenue reflected here is both the tax revenue plus other types of revenue that government raises. Expenditure will rise, as I've indicated, from 2.2 trillion to just under 2.5 trillion over the medium term. We will still have a deficit, but the deficit will be declining over the next 3 years, reflecting the success of our fiscal consolidation efforts, as well as the improved revenue estimates over the medium term. The debt of government in gross terms in this year is estimated to be 4.7 trillion rands, and we still anticipate that in nominal terms this will increase. However, as a percentage of GDP, government debt will begin to decline over the next 3 years. Turning to the division of revenue, which outlines the division of revenue between national, provinces, and local government. Let me summarize the division of revenue by indicating that the relatively higher share for national government reflects the extension of the social relief of distress grant, which of course is paid from national by the Department of Social Development. However, we're still maintaining a growth in the share of local government in particular, which will exceed 10% of the division of revenue over the next 3 years. It's also important to indicate that local government's share is, aside from the fact that municipalities raise most of their own revenue through property rates, as well as electricity tariffs that they charge households, and other tariffs such as water, for instance, which funds most of their budgets. As we draw to a close, we reflect briefly on the risks to the fiscal outlook. Notwithstanding the numbers that we have presented here today, as well as the fiscal strategy, there are significant risks to the outlook. And these risks, as indicated, are very much tilted to the downside. Major short to medium-term risks include a slowdown in global economic growth, which would negatively affect domestic growth and, of course, revenue collection, and could worsen the fiscal position. Secondly, a continuing of the electricity supply constraints, which would decelerate economic growth. Third, higher than budgeted public service wage costs would strain the fiscal resources. Additional fiscal measures or reductions in headcounts would be required if this were to happen to contain overall compensation spending. Fourth, the materialization of contingent liabilities and the weak financial position of several state-owned companies. And finally, any new or unfunded spending pressures introduced could result in a faster accumulation of debt and would negatively affect the public finances as presented here today. Chair, I'm going to hand over to the acting DG at this point. Thank you.
So, honorable members and chair, I think just to underpin it with the documents that we released, obviously there is the speech, the minister's speech and the MTBPS document. But you'll see that I think the minister tabled 8 pieces of legislation. 3 of them, of course, is just the annual tax legislation, the TLAB and TALAB and rates bills, which give effect, as you know, to the budget of February. And then we've got the adjusted appropriations, the division of revenue bill and so on to deal with the changes for the allocations this year. But I do want to just bring to your attention that there is a special appropriation bill which deals with the allocations to Denel, Transnet, and Sanral. And Chair, I should add that most, contrary to what I said at the start, most of our management team are actually here. They've been able to break from the road shows. And I should add that Commissioner Kiswetter and his team are also present here, so to answer questions. I just want to add, though, I don't know if you want to say anything on a special appropriation bill. You've already said it. Okay. Chair, but I just wanted to make the point that in the case of Sanral, and it's attracted a lot of interest, that the government will be taking over the debt and interest obligations of Sanral related to phase 1 of GFIP. And these obligations, as the minister announced, will be shared between the national and provincial government, 70-30. The province has also committed to funding the operation and maintenance costs of phase 1. Chair, we're still in the process of working through a formal agreement with the province. So that's just the outline of what we have. And can I add that at this stage, there's certainly not just at this stage, there's no decision to scrap the e-toll system, nor to transfer roads. Those, to the extent that anything would happen, they would be subject to discussion process. We've got to consult with all the bondholders, just like in the case of Eskom, when the minister announced that we couldn't deal with the quantum, the amount of debt we took over, because we have to wait on the NERSA decision in December, but more important, or as importantly, we've got to engage with all the bondholders. So a lot of that is not, those are not yet decisions taken by government, but they are work in process and subject to a process. So work in progress, subject to a process and engagements with bondholders, and then the final decisions will be made on those. Okay. So I'll stop there. Do you want to add on?
Yeah, I just want to conclude. Yeah, Chair, if I may conclude, and then after that clarity, and then we can obviously hand back, or if the minister wants to make a closing remark. Yeah, so to conclude, Chair, what are we saying in the presentation We're saying there is a broad slowdown in global growth and a high inflation, and these are now part of our forecast. Rapid and decisive implementation of structural reforms, especially in the energy sector, supported by a clear and stable macroeconomic framework and improved state capability, remain crucial to improve the economy's productive capacity and international competitiveness. Third, the fiscal position has improved since the 2022 budget as a result of better than expected revenue collection. Government will use this revenue to increase spending in health, education, and local government free basic services, as well as infrastructure and safety and security. At the same time, it will narrow the budget deficit and address fiscal and economic risk posed by the financial obligations of Denel, Sunral, and Transnet. Municipalities will receive support to cover cost increases in free basic services. Government faces a range of fiscal risks over the medium term, and these risks, significant efforts will be required across the public sector to prevent these risks from materializing and to mitigate those that do. And finally, government is working to improve the efficiency of spending and remains committed to returning the public finances to a sustainable position. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Honourable Minister, Acting DG, Momo and Edgar for the presentation. Thank you very much. We'll be taking questions, but before I do that, let me welcome the Commissioner of SARS. I think yes, him and the team have made it possible for us to be talking about these expenditures and these improvements that we are talking about as far as the fiscal framework is concerned. You are welcome, Commissioner, and your team. Then Secretariat, please note the apology of the Chair Tikeleti Mahlangu. She's just not feeling well. I tried to speak to her. She's struggling with flu. Let's note that. Honourable members, as you can see, there are many of us here. Let me start by taking hands.
Peters.
Okay, I see Peters. I see Honourable Marais. In that order, any other honourable member? Is Honourable Ocamp, am I right? Honourable George, Honourable De Villiers, let me stop at that, or Honourable Sheikh. Let me stop there, then I'll take other names. So, honourable members, I think you noted your names. Help me, there are many of us here. And I'll also request the honourable members that please, let's try to be as brief as possible. There are many of us here, as we heard that the honourable members from NCOP must also be going to the House. And I think the same applies to the National Assembly. Let's start in that order. Honourable Peters.
Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you very much. I think my video has got some problem, so I would request to be allowed to switch off. If you so agree, Chair.
It's okay, Honourable Peters. Please continue.
Yes, thank you, Chairperson. And I want to thank the Minister, the Acting DG, and National Treasury for the presentation and for briefing us with regard to the MTBPS. And Chairperson, on the economic outlook, and I'm just going to be short on that part, and it's related to the mention by both the DG and the presenter. I didn't get his name well. The presenter of, pardon?
Edgar Sishi.
Oh, Mr. Sishi. I appreciate the indications with regard to the impact of the damage to the KZN, Eastern Cape, and many parts of the country. And I would believe that these damages are going to continue because, truly speaking, climate change is on us. And we tend to speak about climate change a lot when it is probably our time to host, because I remember that towards 2011 with COP17, there was so much talk about the impact of climate change. But beyond that, we seem to be very quiet about it, except where the minister and the Minister of Mineral Resources and Energy, and maybe the Minister of Environment and Forestry and Fisheries would mention issues related to climate change. But I would believe that as a country, we need to sustain this particular matter and speak about the impact of climate change on society broadly. The other thing, Chairperson, is related to the issue of the dam in Jagersfontein. I would believe that these disasters happen. And when the disasters happen, it's like we are not ready to be able to address the social impact of the disaster, especially on the poorest of the poor. And I would believe at all times, government has always been having resources for disaster, and that is why provinces cannot declare disasters unless in engagement in concurrence with national. So I can't believe that after the floods in KZN in April last year, to date, we are still talking about people who are still living in halls and all those type of things. And I think the bickering and this one did that or this one did not do that between KZN government and national government is also not giving confidence to our people that their matters will be addressed. Thank you for regard to that, Chairperson. The other issue, I'm still on, Chairperson. The other issue is with regard to the special appropriations that we will be dealing with, the 23+ billion rand that will be used for the GFIP. And I just want to know where the money for this 23 billion would come from, but also the minister said it is an initial allocation. What is the total quantum for this arrangement between Gauteng and a central or national government? Because it is important. Chairperson, as we sit, there is problems with regard to roads throughout the country. I can speak about the road between Hoopstad and Bloemhof. I can speak about the road between Bultfontein and Herzogsville. I would speak about the R31 that is Daniel Scale to Kimberley, which is being eaten away by water. And I would believe that there's a wetlands emerging. And if we focus only on mentioning the roads with regard to Gauteng, and in particular, not Gauteng, Johannesburg, Tshwane, and Ekurhuleni, then we don't speak about the pothole-riddled roads in this country, where the motorist has even developed nicknames for some of the roads, calling them that interchange and that interchange. But also, Chairperson, the minister mentioned the issue related to the expansion of SRD. We really appreciate that because in our communities, in our constituencies, we deal with people who don't even have somebody to turn to. So the SRD is a true intervention that is welcomed. But also, I want to know from the Minister and National Treasury, is there a problem in naming this consideration of the expansion of the SRD grant as work towards the basic income grant? I would believe that it is important that National Treasury calls this what it is, that you are investigating the financial implication, I don't know what to call it, the viability of a basic income grant, because that is what it is. We keep on saying there's an expansion of the SRG to 2024. Initially, it was to 2023. But truly, Chairperson, it will work out better for our people to understand that this consideration National Treasury is speaking about, and the Minister Godongwan, is looking at a possible sustainable intervention in this particular regard. And I remember, Chairperson, as this committee, we always have the communities coming to present during public hearings. And also, Chairperson, it would be important that the National Treasury with their agencies could also be talking about taxing the rich to be able to cover whatever the grant would be required, and be able to call that tax by its name. So I would believe that is possible.
Honorable Peters,
Chairperson.
Injury time.
Okay, Chairperson, let me just quickly conclude. I am smiling alone here, listening to this presentation by the Minister of Finance, in particular, Comrade Godongwan, talking about independent transmission and system operator. The minister knows what I'm talking about. And Chairperson, given another opportunity, I'll go back to the debt service cost issue.
Thank you, Honorable Peters. My apologies. As I said at the beginning, the main honorable members here. I think the next honorable member will be Honorable Mare.
Thank you, Chair. My questions are, firstly, with regards to inflation, I wanted to understand how inflation in South Africa compares to others across the globe, and what are the risks of our high inflation as it stands. I'm particularly concerned if we were to go into a recession or a global depression, what that might mean. I'm just putting on my video now. Then I also wanted to understand what were the contributors to our high inflation. Are we practicing quantitative easing, or are there other factors at play? Then, Chair, I wanted to understand, so the speaker spoke about how we were plagued with the Ukrainian crisis and how COVID had an impact and other global affairs. So I wanted to just get an understanding of what are some of the protective factors that South Africa has, and how we can kind of insulate our economy amid the impact of global economic decline. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Member. Honorable George, please.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. My questions are to the Minister. Thanks very much for the presentation. You mentioned the conditions, that there would be conditions for the additional bailouts to Sunrail, Denel, and Transnet, and have already tabled a special appropriations bill to give the 30 billion to them. Where are the conditions that are going to be attached to these bailouts? That's the first question. And then the second question is also, Minister, you were completely silent on the spiraling cost of living that has already resulted in South African households not being able to put enough food on their tables, other than the extension of the social relief of distress grant. What action are you going to take to respond to this cost of living crisis, especially the spiraling cost of food? And then my third and final question, on the future of the grants, you mentioned very difficult trade-offs and financing decisions that need to be taken. What are these trade-offs? If you could give some detail on that. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you, Honorable George. Honorable Occam, please come in.
Thank you, Honorable Chairperson. Honorable Chairperson, yeah, my questions are also directed at the Minister. I have been partially covered by the Honorable George with regards to the bailouts to the state-owned enterprises. I just want to mention that we must remember that in the past, a lot of these bailouts were given, and up to today, we can't see any improvement. We don't see that things were turned around, and the problem that we've got is, in a lot of instances, it is the same people that manage those companies into the dark hole that are still at the management of those companies. So the big question is, as the Honorable Dion George also said, what are those conditions or preconditions for the money to be made available to those state-owned enterprises. I think it's very important that stringent conditions are laid down, and that there must be consequence management if those conditions aren't being followed. The other question that I want to ask is with regards to that. We have suggested an increase in the amount of articles that must be put into the basket of zero-based VAT items. We haven't heard anything about that. Is there an ongoing investigation into the possibility of implementing that? And then my last question is with regards to the fuel levy. From the DA side, we have also suggested that the fuel levy be relooked at, and we also suggested areas where it can be cut. We didn't hear anything about that yesterday. Are the minister looking into that, or the ministry or treasury looking into that? And if so, what are the timelines for a possible implementation thereof? Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Honourable De Villiers.
Thank you, Chairperson. My question is firstly also on the bailout for Eskom. As my colleague Dion George mentioned, we'd like to understand the conditions, and specifically, we'd like to understand how the minister is going to stop Eskom from just taking on more debt itself if the government now takes over its debt. As we've pointed out, investors love Eskom bonds. They are high yielding, they're guaranteed by government. So what stops Eskom from just borrowing more money once we the taxpayers take over their current debt? Doesn't the minister think that that's really just treating a symptom and not the cause? I mean, fundamentally, everybody who's ever written about Eskom agrees that it's the business model that's currently the problem. It needs to be split up. A private power generation needs to be brought in. Eskom needs to just take management of the grid. We know these things, but it seems like that is not a priority. Changing Eskom its business model is not the priority. Giving Eskom more money, or rather taking over its debt, is just going to reinforce the current business model, which essentially is just not working. So we would really advise against taking over Eskom's debt. We think it's a massive mistake. It's not like our country can currently carry more debt. I mean, we are on over 70% debt to GDP ratio, and it is reckless for us to take over Eskom's debt. And then secondly, the e-tolls decision is puzzling, just at least. We'd like to understand. It seems like where the e-toll debt is being taken over, but e-tolls are not being scrapped. Minister, there's only one thing to do with e-tolls. They need to be scrapped. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you, Honourable Member. Honourable Ryder.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair, and thank you for to the Minister. I'd like to echo firstly the congratulations for the overcollection beyond what was expected. But more importantly, I think we should commend the taxpayers, because really it's the taxpayers that have come to the party in a big way. So we must remember that they are a very vital part of this cog, and we say well done to them. My colleagues have spoken about the conditions. I won't harp further on that. Mr. Sishi mentioned the issue around the potential risk of the public wage settlement, which is very probably going to be above what has been budgeted for. Now, there was comments that it was 3% that was budgeted for. COSATU has again come through and said, no, they're sticking to their guns, they've reverted to their 10%. So we are likely to see some sort of a settlement in the middle of that, or maybe even closer to the 10% mark, noting the fact that we are coming up for an election year next year, and government needs all the support it can get. So what's the potential impact of that higher than expected settlement going to be? Obviously, it's going to be a bit of a moving target until we can work out exactly what the percentage amount will be. But perhaps we can get an indication as to the rand amount that the impact will have, and certainly on a scaled basis in terms of the percentage. My last question, Chair, relates to the e-tolls issue. I am obviously an NCOP member representing Gauteng. So it's an important issue for us, certainly. And I think that, yes, again, the Minister has indicated and that there is a lot more discussion still to happen. I think Momo also mentioned that it hasn't all been nailed down yet. But the second sentence, the final sentence in the Minister's comments about SANRAL in his speech yesterday indicated that the gantries will still stay in place and that there is likely to still be a payment needed from Gauteng motorists. Perhaps you can give us a little bit more of an idea of what the intention model is going forward. Will Gauteng motorists still be having to pay some sort of e-tolls? Will it be a reduced amount? What is your plan? Thank you.
Honorable Sheikh Imam, still there? Honorable Sheikh Imam. Okay, Honorable Kaiso.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chair, and greetings to the team of the Minister. I'd like to welcome the presentation made by the Minister and the team from Treasury. Honorable Chair, let me outrightly agree with what Honorable Dipuo Peters has raised with regard to the issue of disasters, especially in KZN, which seem not to have been, taken quite good, that area which was not treated very good in as far as agency is concerned, and it would reflect very bad. Therefore, it does mean that in future there has to be always, a need to respond very prompt to the social needs when such, disasters have occurred. So I do agree with what Honorable Dipuo has said. And I also believe that the issue of Jagersfontein is one part of the disaster which happened recently, even though I didn't hear the presentation saying, okay, part of the Free State, Jagersfontein, but I want to believe it should be covered as well in that particular arrangement by Treasury. But then from the Minister, I just want to get some clarity on them, so that sometimes we talk of a developmental state, a developmental democratic state, and then sometimes things point differently at some level. So I just want to understand what is meant by unlocking massive private investment in Eskom. Does it mean partial privatization or something that maybe one does not understand well, as well as the issue of posts? What type of competition is to be introduced in ports? Does that mean also partial privatization or something else that I may need to be clarified on? And as well as on the issue of water agencies. So water agencies, I'm not sure also we refer to private or what. So I would be glad if we can be clarified, one can be clarified around that particular matter. So I also want to agree, Honorable Chair, on the issue of big basic income grant. And we have been talking about this expansion several times, expansions or extensions. But definitely what people need to see, they want something that is sustainable, which could assist them in terms of the economic, social problems that they are facing. So if we talk about big, expansion or extension year after year, we would rather look at the situation where we actually talk about big and say, this the name of this thing that we are doing is now big. because obviously there should be a base where something starts. We should be able to say we start here, and this thing is called now big. That's where this is a baseline. We start here, moving forward. It will be expanded. I mean, it will be managed accordingly to now fit the whole needs of the people in as far as big is concerned, rather than we talk about expansion of SRD or expansion of this and that. So that's my question, Honorable Chair. And lastly, second to last question on the issue of conditions. I think in this committee we have talked about conditions in the previous meetings when the issue of bailouts was being discussed. But it doesn't seem that the issue of conditions was taken seriously. And if things were really to work well, one would suggest that we shouldn't just pour money into the same, arrangement where after a while there's no impact, and they are the same people who are managing the same environment. So it does tell me, okay, now that over the years I've been pouring money into the same hole and does not have any impact, it means I must change the horses inside that. So that's the game that now has to unfold, because we cannot agree to just throw money in the same conditions and be managed by the same people. We can imagine what is happening at ESCOM as it is being said in some quarters now. A gang of a syndicate is roaming around the area, opening spaza shop, criminal spaza shop, siphoning ESCOM to its knees. So it means there's something wrong with other people who are inside there. So there has to be overhaul.
Injury time.
There has to be overhaul. Thank you. Lastly, I agree on the issue of there must be tax on the wealthy so that they subsidize the poor. It's a good suggestion, but it doesn't seem to be taken serious. Little have we made any reference to the issue of unemployment, to the issue that is related to inflation. Actually, the Reserve Bank was supposed to be the person who's supposed to assist us, but there isn't any way that is been, said how Reserve Bank. Yes, I do understand that there's an issue on inflation, but the Reserve Bank has to come more, not only on the inflation. Thank you very much, Chair.
Honorable Ntlangwini.
Thank you very much, Chairperson, and thank you to the presenters for the presentation. Chair, I have one or two questions. Mine is basically on the 15,000 police officers that the minister have mentioned in his speech. And one will want to ask, have they done proper research and to see what is the ratio pertaining to how many women and children are killed in South Africa on a daily basis? And that 15,000 police officials will only be ready after 3 years. Yet we are sitting with a pandemic where women and children are being killed daily. And it's somewhat having us or letting us feel as women, as in this country, that we are having a national treasury that doesn't take the violence on women seriously. Perhaps maybe it's because also they are led by a person that are looking in spas for happy endings. That can be also maybe perhaps why we are sitting with what we are sitting with within a median statement. Only one line is addressing the pandemic and the violence upon women in this country, and it's quite scary. And then secondly, Chairperson, local government is yet again given the lowest of the cut, and it is carrying the brunt of service delivery, and it's at the heart and the cold face of service delivery of our people. Can National Treasury perhaps give us synopsis why they are giving always local government such a small stake of the pie of government's revenue, and not cutting or the province, because province for now it seems to be the middleman, and it's getting more money than the local government that is at the cold face of service delivery. And one would have expected that local government would have gotten more of the resource of government than provinces. And you could see, as per in maybe let me use an example in the Jagersfontein saga there, whereby there's a fight off between province and local government. The one, don't know which excuses do they need to give to those communities. So I think it's time that we do a proper research to cut provinces, which is the middleman per se now, and have only a national government and a local government. And then the last one is on the conditions to the entities that the minister spoke about in his medium statement. One needs to get proper understanding what is exactly these conditions, because tomorrow we will have conditions that is stating, and we don't know as the Committee of Appropriations, what is this conditions line by line. So one needs to say to National Treasury, we need these conditions to be published so that we know exactly, as people that are following the money, these two committees knows exactly what are the conditions that were set for the NELS and all of these other entities that are getting getting bailouts from the government, so that we don't go tomorrow and then and we're asking them questions, and these entities are saying, but that was never one of my conditions. Because one of the conditions can be tomorrow saying, deliver a fuel at the president's house for 1 cent per liter. And that is a condition. So one needs to understand what is the real conditions, whether it's 5 conditions or 20 conditions. Let's hear the conditions and see it, and it must be public to South Africans, not conditions that are just there under a carpet and we don't know as South Africans what are the true conditions of giving these entities the bailout. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Ntlangwini. Honorable Sarupen, please come in.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Apologies for the camera. I have bandwidth issues, as you know. Please let me know if you can not hear me or if I break up.
We can hear you. In your leadership. Our members and everybody who's on the platform, please make sure that your mics are switched off so that you allow the speakers to speak. Honorable Sarupen, please come in.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the protection, Chair. Chair, let me start where many members left off, and that's on bailouts. The last time bailouts were the conditions for bailouts were disclosed to the Appropriations Committee, we discovered there were sweetheart conditions being imposed by National Treasury, and some conditions included producing a quarterly report in certain financial areas and so on and so forth. And we all know that it's not the reporting issue that exists that's a problem. It is a management issue that exists. And so none of the conditions in the past were actually of any use on how these SOEs were being managed. So what we end up creating is a moral hazard where they know that they can do what they want and mismanage the SOEs because they will always get money from the states. And that takes me to my second point, Chair, on the proposed transfer of Eskom debt from Eskom to the state's balance sheet. This sends a message to all the other SOEs that no matter how badly you've borrowed and misspent and mismanaged, no matter how much has been looted, continue doing it because the government will take on your debt when you become unsustainable. And I'd like to get a clear answer from the finance minister as to how he is going to deal with that situation. Because for as much as we've had a Zondo Commission and other things, you still very much have a lot of people with very nefarious intentions up and down government who may well see this as an opportunity now to accumulate more SOE debt as SOE debt gets transferred to the state. And then lastly, what will a balance transfer from Eskom to the state due to our debt to GDP ratio? And I've heard the comments from Treasury officials around the fact that the quantum still needs to be measured depending on the bondholders and that sort of thing. But will that not mean that the Treasury's report yesterday and in their booklets about stabilizing debt to GDP ratio and achieving a lower debt to GDP ratio by 2024 than anticipated in last year's MTBPS, is that not entirely incorrect considering the intention of what they intend to do with Eskom? And if so, was that not effectively printing misinformation? Because we know that the debt to GDP ratio would rise. And if they take all 400 billion rand of Eskom debt onto the state's balance sheet, we would reach a debt to GDP ratio of nearly 100%. What would that do to the ability of the state to borrow, to fund infrastructure, to fund services and all the essentials that the state has had to borrow for over the last couple of years? I'd love to get an answer to that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Sarupen. Honorable Murolong. Honorable Murolong.
Well, thank you very much, Chairperson. Let me apologize and maybe start with a disclaimer that I have connectivity issues. And because my connectivity has been intermittent.
Just hold. Okay, honorable members and everybody who's on the platform, let's please respect the speaker who's on the platform and who's asking a question and making an input. Thank you. Please continue.
Thank you very much, Chair. I was saying that perhaps I must start with a disclaimer that my connectivity has been intermittent. And so some of the questions that I may want to raise may have been either raised by other members or may have been responded to through presentations. So please excuse me if I'm going to regurgitate what has been expressed here. Let me thank the Minister and the acting DG for their and their teams for their presentations. I'm going to be quite brief, Chair. My first question is, to what extent is the revenue overrun attributed to stronger tax collections and commodity cycle? My second question is, what were the determinant factors to support some SOEs as opposed to others? For example, Denel, Eskom, Post Office, Transnet are supported, but the same support is not lended to SAA or Post Office. The next question says that the employment stimulus was established or was scheduled to end in 2024. However, public employment programs have stayed stable into 2025. Should we see this as an indication that the employment stimulus will continue? The next one is Treasury has built in unallocated reserves for 2025 and 2026. Why is this? My last question is progress on Operation Vulindlela. If you can get a sense of what is the progress registered thus far on Operation Vulindlela. Thank you very much.
Honorable Luana, please come in.
Thank you, Chairperson. Good afternoon to you, and good afternoon to the Minister and all members that are here. Chairperson, I just want to say that I have noted the improvement in the the fiscal position, so to speak, and further wish to applaud the collection by our revenue services. And again, to welcome the commitment to increase spending in health, and education, amongst others. But further note the interventions to the fiscal space of Transnet, Denel, and Sandra. My two areas of concern, though, Chair, is the 3% increase cap on public sector wage against the imminent labor showdown. And the question is, how prepared are we as the country to mitigate when circumstances go beyond what has been put in place? It's something that has not come up clearly on my side. And the last part, Chair, is of course already covered by one member on the low funding towards local government. And that low funding, which now stands at 10%, is continuing to expose the very low revenue base, especially to medium and small municipalities. How do we turn this around, given that this formula has not been helping us to improve the conditions of our people in those affected areas? Thank you very much.
Thank you, honorable members. Let me also join the honorable members, colleagues, for welcoming the presentation by the Minister, Acting DG, and Mr. Sishi. My questions, they'll also impact on what has been raised by other honorable members. Minister, there seems to be a view that the problems of SOEs are money problems only, that once you throw in money, and then the problems are gone. I'll tell you why. One has been reading with a lot of trepidation the question of many SOEs having failed to present their annual reports as expected by PFMA. That shows very low levels of governance. What assurance do you want to give us here that the governance at the SOEs is at the required level if such basic things can't be done? So they're now they're going to coming with come begging for funds that money should be allocated. But simple things like complying with PFMA in terms of presenting the reports to Parliament, so that we are allowed to play our oversight function. It is a concern, but I would like to hear from the Minister, what are you doing about that? Two, related to that, it's a question which has been raised by the honorable members here, the question of moral hazard. Too big to fail, too important to fail. And we get an impression of SOEs, they know how important we are, and therefore there's no way they're not going to give us money. How are we mitigating that as National Treasury? And is it working? If it is working, what is that indicator that you are looking at to say it is working? How much have we lost as a country as far as revenue is concerned because of the highest load shedding seen in our country in terms of hours that have been lost? Perhaps related to that, what has been the impact of GDP? How much of that has been lost? How much of GDP has been lost because of load shedding? That's very important for your fiscal stability and sustainability, because it affects both of your your numerator and the denominator. If those things have been working, I'm sure we'll be having a better debt to GDP ratio. I think I would ask the same question about the Transnet, its impact on the revenues and its impact on GDP. My hypothesis would be, if they were functioning optimally, and at least to be where they were about 2-3 years ago, will be having a better outcome as far as revenue and as far as GDP is concerned. We'll allow the minister and his team to respond to the questions. Minister and acting DG and the team, you'll be able to say who answers what, and the time it's 2 o'clock. If we can try to be done by 2:30, as you heard, the member said that they must go and attend other meetings at 2:30. Honorable Minister, back to you.
Thank you, Chairperson. I'll just deal with some broad issues and allow the DG to allocate his team to each of the topics. The first broad issue I want to deal with is the basic income grant issue. As things stand, there's no policy by the executive on basic income grant. What we're dealing with is a temporary grant which was intended to support the vulnerable during the COVID period. It has justifiably been extended given the cost of living challenges that are facing the country now, but it's not and has never been labeled as a basic income grant. I want to make that broad issue here. The second broad issue, the managers, the team is going to deal with the detail, is about the trade-offs. Is about the trade-offs, which also talk to the police issue, or the honorable member referred to, why we cannot. If you look at the police, we said we wanted 10,000 police this year. Initially, we indicated another 10 next year and 10 in over the outer year. So initially we're talking about 30,000 moving forward. Precisely because of the trade-offs. When we're extending government took the decision to extend the grant with no revenue source, we had to reprioritize the budget, not because we wanted to cut the police, that's the trade-offs. So by extending the grant, we have included trade-offs associated with it. The issue of whether motorists are going to pay in Gauteng, yes, of course they have. Now, the question is whether they are going to pay it via their equitable share in Gauteng, or they are going to via paying through a toll, or they are going to pay it via any other taxes the provincial government is empowered to tax. Gauteng people will have to pay for the maintenance of the roads. The question is going to be what that method should be. Honorable Mrolong makes reference to the other institutions which have not been attended to. It's quite impressive. I don't have the figures for the post office, but it would be interesting to note that SAA, to date, it has taken 46 billion rand. It's not that it's been single. To date, it has taken 46 billion rand. That the request for another 2.3 billion rand wouldn't take it to 49. So it has not been treated differently. I take the point the Honorable Chair is raising about moral hazard, and the people are going to talk about it. As we stand up to this financial year, Eskom has been given 230 billion to date. Now, so the choice, I mean, we are in a, do we have a choice? We're in a, between a hard and a, what is it? Rock and hard place. Because if we don't intervene, that's why some people say it's too big to fail, Eskom may default, and in doing so, drag the sovereign with them. The question as the conditions which we'll attach Dr. Peterson, then we'll talk to that in a moment. We'll talk to that in a moment. I'm going to ask the acting DG to allocate his team to deal with some of the issues that have been raised. What? Should I deal with? Okay. Let me deal with the wages and unions. Wages and unions. We had, after a long period, we reached an agreement with the unions through a facilitated process, which we agreed to table at the bargaining council. When this matter was tabled at the bargaining council, all constituencies, including ourselves, had to go and sell it back to our constituencies, which we went to sell to the mandating committee of cabinet, which include the 9 premiers. It has not been a good sell for us, particularly from the provinces who were hitting hard on us because they have got a huge salary bill. But we managed to sell it. But the unions come back, they not even said we tried to sell it, members didn't buy it. They came back and said their members reject a deal which was tentatively agreed with them. So in the circumstances, we've got no option but to implement. Are we making any contingency plans? We are in the process of continually discussing. We have not closed our door to the discussion with the union at the moment. We will continue to discuss with them on the salary issues. I can say to Honorable Peters, I know that type is precisely because in the old days in 2012, I opposed the independent transmission. I'm educated, I've changed, Honorable Peters. DG, can you allocate your people to answer some of the questions? And if there's any other you want me to deal with, I'll deal with.
Okay. No, thanks, Minister. I think, yeah, we can put the questions just around themes because there are many similar questions. So the one theme I think is on SOEs and the conditions. The Minister's answered it partially, but I think Duncan Peterson is here, he can answer, and Dr. Mampo Modise can answer specifically on Sandra. I think let's start with those because there were many questions and they covered ports, water agencies, the issue of moral hazard. Yeah, and what? Yeah, so Duncan, do you want to kick off?
Before they come, acting DG, I thought yourself or the minister was going to address this one. The question of governance, where we're having a situation where the SOEs are coming for money, but they can't comply with the basic thing which all companies and departments should do. Do you want to address how addressing that?
Yeah, look, I think, Chair, I think for me, governance, the way I take it, there's 2 parts to what you're asking. The first, I think, relates to, in a sense, the president's statement on Sunday, where he deals with processes on how to, in response to the Zondo Commission, how boards will be appointed, and to obviously get boards that have the right skills, so that you at least ensure that the right people are appointed, whether it's in management or on boards, to make the right decisions. So that's a whole area of governance. And of course, it relates to how you deal with procurement, whether the boards get involved with procurement and so on. I won't go into that detail, but I think, Chair, perhaps we're also just referring to how they come into the budget process and the question of moral hazard, because many of these entities almost come at a point where it's hard to say no, and they default on, the threat that they're going to default on their debt and so on. Like the minister says, pulls down the sovereign, that we need to find effective measures to take in-year action or before it becomes a problem. And I think, like was said, that many of them provide reports, but are there consequences? Now, there are limits to various powers that we have. And I think, but again, I think Duncan Pfister is really in a position to answer. And I know that we've talked about conditions, and I should add, when the conditions are there, they will be made public just to deal with concerns that members have raised. Chair, I don't know if I've fully answered your question, but if not, you can come back and maybe spell out what you need, what more you need on governance. But if Duncan can answer, I think he's been looking at a lot of those issues.
Yeah, thanks, Momo, and thanks, Minister. Good afternoon, Chair and honorable members. There were quite a few questions on ESCOM conditions. How do we stop ESCOM? Yes, Chair.
You may switch off your video. We are losing you. You may switch off your video. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me now?
Much better. Thank you.
Okay. Apologies for that, Chair. So as I was saying, there were quite a few questions around ESCOM conditions, how we stop them from incurring more debt, treating the symptoms, not the problem, proper conditions versus reporting, and so on. So I'd like to speak just to a few of those issues. I think the point, and maybe to start with ESCOM, those conditions have not yet been finalized, but they have been the subject of discussion between ourselves and ESCOM and the department over the last few months. And as Momo has indicated, those conditions will be made public as we've done in the past with other conditions. But just to give a sense of what we foresee that they will include at this stage, they will include things like the sale of non-core assets in the entity in order to make sure that the balance sheet is sustainable and fit for purpose. It will include certain things around operational improvements, including the management of costs, and it will include commitments around how plan going forward. As the ministers indicated, we are also planning to undertake an independent assessment of the operations of ESCOM, in particular the generation fleet, to ensure that the conditions are informed by and responsive to the real operational challenges at the entity. Because as quite a few members have mentioned, there's no point in dealing with the debt unless we deal with the underlying challenges that the entity faces. The minister also emphasized the fact that there will be preconditions, and the idea about preconditions is to deal precisely with the moral hazard that some of the members have indicated, which is, and the minister indicated in his speech, that unless those conditions are met, the funding will not flow. Finally, on ESCOM, Chair, it's worth pointing out that the debt takeover is only one part of a broader package to ensure that the entity is going to be sustainable going forward. And the details of that package will obviously be captured in the conditions, but will also be announced. Further update on that will be given at the time of the budget next year. There were also, Chair, of quite a few questions around the broader conditions to other state-owned companies. And I think, again, here, the answers are similar. The one is, as Momo's indicated, those conditions will be made public once finalized. I think that is important. And of course, Parliament that will be also made available and engaged upon with Parliament. There will also be preconditions as the minister confirmed in the speech. So to the extent that the entities do not meet those conditions, the funding will not flow to them in order to manage that moral hazard. And the conditions are really, they go far beyond just merely monthly reporting. And I think that's maybe some of the mistakes we've made in the past, where the conditions have really focused on reporting requirements as opposed to dealing really with the underlying issues. And for Denel, Sunral, and some of the other entities that are getting bailouts, some of those conditions again include things like the execution of a proper turnaround plan so that the entity has a business case going forward, the disposal of any non-core assets in order to resolve the balance sheet challenges, the fact that the bailouts are for debt specifically, and in some cases government guarantees will be reduced in line with that debt, the fact that there will need to be certain operational improvements and certain assessments of operations in order to make sure that the entities are sustainable going forward. So I think we are really trying to make sure that through these conditions, we don't have a situation where the entities keep coming back for more money, and that we manage the moral hazard associated with implementing these kinds of SOC supports. I hope that covers the range of questions around SOCs and conditions. I am here with my other colleagues, Minister and Momo, so I can hand over now to them to cover some of their questions, if that's okay.
Thanks, Duncan. Good afternoon, Chairperson, honorable members. This is Mampu Modise, Head of Public Finance at the National Treasury. So the two groups of or types of questions that I wanted to...
Mampu,
Chairperson?
Are you able to show your face? Let's see, you know, we've got a request from a communication that, yeah, let's see whether you can continue there. If we are struggling, then we can switch you off.
Thanks, Chairperson. So the two groups of questions I was referring to, the first one would be on disaster funding. I think the book, we have proposed additional for Department of Transport and COGTA, and this is through the unforeseeable and unavoidable expenditure where around 6 billion has been added as an added allocation. So we are trying to respond to the disasters, and what we have also done is to pencil in money for the next 3 years, and this has been damaged. So in terms of the financial, the impact of the disaster, we have done the allocations. And I think for Sunral, I'm just adding to the Minister and Momo's comments. Basically, the key condition for this entity is that the amount that has been provided for must strictly pay for the guaranteed debt and the interest, of course. But also what we will then do is that for every amount that we would have given to Sunral, we will reduce the government guaranteed debt. So we basically reducing their ability to use the guaranteed debt, because government will definitely be paying for it. And we will then have to ensure that if Sunral wants to go out and borrow, there's a proper conversation between the Transport Sunral and the Minister of Finance. And then of course you will have the operational conditions where they have to report, they need to send reports. So I think the key for Sunral in terms of dealing with their debt is just to make sure that we reduce the debt as and when we pay the interest and the redemption. Thank you, Chairperson. Thank you, Minister. I will hand over to Boipuso now.
Good afternoon, Chairperson. Good afternoon, Minister. I'm Boipuso Modise. I'm the Acting Head of Economic Policy. And I will be taking the questions that were posed regarding inflation, as well as some questions regarding the impact of load shedding on economic activity, along with some constraints in the logistical sector, and give a brief progress update on Operation Vulindlela. So to begin, and please do, my apologies if I didn't catch the entire first question on inflation. If I haven't, please do let me know and I'll follow up. But I understood the question initially to be what are the core drivers of inflation in South Africa, but also how do we compare to some of our peers? So to begin, the core drivers of inflation in our assessment in the South African context have primarily been from non-core inflation, largely from food and fuel inflation. But what we're concerned about is we're seeing this start to pass through more into core, which could have implications for the durability of sort of the surge of inflation that we're seeing at the moment. How do we compare to our peers? So briefly to give an indication, so you would have seen from our publication, our assessment of inflation for 2021, for 2022, my apologies, is 6.7%. That is less, that is lower than the IMF projects for the EM average at about 9.9%. And it's similar in the following year, where we're expecting inflation to come in South Africa at about 5.1%, whereas inflation is expected to relatively ease to about 8.1% in the following year. So effectively, in all environments, we're seeing significant price pressure. And our inflation is quite high in relation to historical trends, but slightly below emerging market averages. So in terms of the second question, which is around the risks that inflation poses to economic activity, as we mentioned in the book, we're concerned from a domestic perspective about the implications of inflation on the cost of living, on household consumption, and subsequently on GDP, because of its relatively high share to overall GDP. And in terms of, and this is sort of a similar risk to what we see in the rest of the world, where we're concerned that, or at least where the concern has been raised, that inflation and subsequent responses to try and contain inflation might have implications for economic activity and subsequently the pace of growth. In terms of what we think needs to be done or can be done to try and insulate us from the impacts of inflation, but as well as slowdowns in the global economy, our sense of it is, as we've said, chapter 2, regarding sort of the 3 pillars of what we think makes for a sustainable growth strategy. The first is stable macroeconomic policy, including sound macroeconomic policy on the fiscal side, as well as on the monetary policy side, to ensure price sustainability, but also to protect the economy by building necessary buffers against risks that could materialize in the external environment. The second pillar relates to structural reforms, which we've spoken to for quite some time, and I'll speak to some of the progress in this regard when I give some of the updates broadly on the Operation Vulindlela side. And the third speaks to a capable state, which I think is a theme that's come up in a lot of the questions that have come up this afternoon regarding how we think about the interventions that need to be made to ensure that the state is able to provide critical goods and services in a way that is supportive of economic activity. In terms of the second tranche of questions regarding critical SOEs and their impact on growth, let me start with energy availability and load shedding and what we think that's done to the outlook. So let's begin with what we do know. We know, and have published in the book, that in the first 3 quarters of this year alone, we've lost somewhere near 4,197 gigawatt hours to load shedding, which is significant and is the highest level of load shedding on record to date. The costs of this vary depending on the stage and how the costs of it are estimated. And we've recently seen estimates, for example, by the BER that estimated, and I think, if I'm correct, stage 6 load shedding costs somewhere near 500 million rand per hour of stage 6. But I will follow up with those details in the chat, just to clarify. And this, of course, is significant. We're particularly concerned about what this means in an environment where we are seeing growth slow, and are particularly concerned about it in the context of what it means for our growth trajectory, where we've seen a very supportive external environment supported by fairly robust global demand, as well as very high export commodity prices supporting our recovery post-COVID. And we are seeing those prices slow, particularly on the export side. And we're also very mindful of the sharp revisions to global growth, which would have implications for global demand. And we've also published those assumptions in chapter 2. Collectively, this means that we're particularly concerned about these structural impediments to growth that we've spoken to for quite some time, and what they mean for our resilience as an economy and our ability to grow even beyond the risks that the external environment poses. So similarly, on the logistical side, we're particularly concerned about the constraints that logistics, particularly in freight rail, are providing for economic activity more generally, but also for export performance in terms of our ability to take full advantage of some of the external price support and demand support that we've seen historically, but also going forward, what that means for economic activity more structurally, which is why we keep impressing the importance of the expedited implementation of structural reforms to put us on a higher and more sustainable growth trajectory. So thirdly, and in closing, just speaking to some of the updates on Operation Vulindlela, as Edgar had spoken to in his presentation earlier, there has been progress on Operation Vulindlela in sort of 4 key areas. The first being energy and energy generation. And this speaks to the work done under the National Energy Crisis Committee, or NECOM, that looks at increasing Eskom's performance, as well as ensuring increased private sector participation in energy generation through, for instance, renewable energy, as well as embedded generation. And a lot of work has been done in that regard, which is available both in Chapter 2 and in the presentation that Edgar gave. The other areas where progress has been made are in transport, as well as telecommunications. Some key highlights there are the completion of the auction of spectrum, and also in visa reforms, where some key progress includes the reviewing of the framework for work visas, as well as the e-visa system, which has been implemented in 14 countries. And as I'd mentioned, a lot more detail is available both on the Operation Vulindlela website, where we have a dashboard that gives a sense of progress update, but we've also given a synopsis both in the book and in the presentation. I'll leave it there in the interest of time and can follow up if there are any other questions. Thank you. I'll hand it back over.
No, thanks, Boypuso. I should add, there were just some questions on the cost of living and what will government do. Will it, for example, zero rate further VAT items? I think there's no discussion really going on. Well, we're not considering reducing or increasing the zero rating list. Bear in mind that, honorable members, in 2017, when VAT was increased by 1%, we had a panel that looked into this matter, and I think broadly came to a list of items that we did put forward, and pointed out that to the extent that government wants to reach poor communities, it's better done through targeted subsidies. And in this respect, I guess government has, as the ministers outlined, the extension of the SRT, I mean, is one of the measures this year that will help to some extent households meet the extra costs. In terms of the fuel levy, we did reduce the fuel levy, but the price has come down since. Yes, it's still high, but we also need to look at, on the revenue side, what we gain. And that generally is the issue with taxes, that on the one hand, we're taxing to get revenue, and the more concessions we allow, it does mean less revenue. And the issue then is, how do we get that right on the spending side? So we're not considering extending the fuel levy, but look, we are monitoring the price of fuel. Things are pretty, as I've said, uncertain. And, you know, if there are any really other negative shocks, we'll try and look at how whether we need to revise or update our approach. I'm going to ask the commissioner to come in just on the revenue side. If he can be brief as well, because I think the minister's got some time limitations. In fact, all of us, if we can be brief now, the committee does want to end shortly. Commissioner?
Thank you, DG. I think, honourable members, just a broad response to revenue. As previously alluded to, we are seeing a tailing down of the impact of the commodities, but thankfully, in the first half of this year, we saw a almost 11% increase in the contribution from the financial sector and an equal percentage from the manufacturing sector. Combined, those two sectors contributes about 56%, 55% of our corporate income taxes. And so you can see when those performances fares well, then we have an overall effect. The balance of that is just what we call a compliance dividend, which means that through the specific compliance actions of SARS, we were able to raise 12% of the total revenue we announced, which means that 92%, 92 billion rand of the revenue result the minister announced as our half-year result was in fact from the improved efficiencies at SARS. We believe that even though we will have cyclicality, that there should continue to be an endowment effect from the compliance dividend, which will underpin the positive revenue outcome that the minister is announcing in the medium term. Let me pause there. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. The minister will come in now to conclude.
Where is it? Yeah. Thank you, Chairperson. Let me thank the honorable members for this engagement, and which is highly appreciated. You raised a pertinent question, and that question is, what about the state-owned enterprises who can't even produce whatever they're supposed to do, operational issues, they can't, the kind of dysfunctionality? What are we doing about that? Which is a tricky question for us, as I can see Mr. George has got his hand up, but which is a tricky question for us. What is that tricky question? Is these institutions also report directly to other ministries. What that means, the difficulty we have, for instance, we're just been called in one of the committees to answer wire department understanding. Our duty is to publish the understanding, but it would be useful if you, Chairperson, can help us so that the relevant portfolio and select committees can begin to hold those departments to account for those issues. I indicated that starting from next week, Wednesday, we also, for instance, on understanding, the Section 32 reports, which are available for everybody for national and provincial governments, Section 71 reports for provincial governments. We are doing an unusual step now in order to raise the flag. We'll always be tabling these issues every quarter in cabinet to ensure that our colleagues are alive to these challenges. That's broadly what we can do in respect of that question, but I would like the honorable chairs who are sitting here, who are in this committee, to also take up this matter with the relevant chairs of other portfolios, so that it becomes a recurrent theme of holding those institutions through the oversight process, the ministries and the relevant institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Acting DG.
Chairperson.
Yes, Mr. George.
Thank you, Chairperson. I just want to raise an issue. I did ask the Minister a question regarding whether there's going to be any action on the cost of living. It was not responded to by the Minister, but it was responded to by the Acting Director General of the Treasury, who indicated that there was no, it sounds like no discussion, no movement, no anything regarding expanding the zero-rated VAT basket of food. But when I asked the Minister in Parliament the question about it, he indicated that if I requested it, he would subject our proposal to a panel of experts, for example. So I think I'm getting a mixed signal here. So I just wanted to know what the clarity actually was, because it seems like the Treasury is saying, no, absolutely, there's no discussion consideration on this, whereas the impression I had from the Minister was not that same way. So I would like the Minister to clarify that, please. Thank you very much.
I allowed you, Honorable George, to come in. But I sometimes take the view that we're still going to interact with the department as different committees. Minister, do you want to deal with this exception? Minister?
In Parliament, Honorable George asked me the question, and I said there was an independent panel of experts which was put into place to look at the zero rating of certain items. That committee did its work. I'm not in a position to make a judgment as an individual. I would be able to make any judgment on the basis of expert advice. Now, I'm not sure whether the honorable member is suggesting that we institute another panel again, because that's what that panel did its work. Then it's not a continuing panel that's available every time. It was a special panel, which when I got to the department, I'm told it was a special panel that did the work and concluded the work. And I'm told the report is on the website. Then maybe the member must interact with that report. At the moment, you know, chairperson, I listen, people said, you must cut this, you must cut this, you must cut the fuel price, you must cut this, you must cut it. On the one hand, which we are reducing revenue. On the one hand, they say, okay, reduce also this thing, reduce. On the one hand, they say, spend more. I mean, we've got to weigh how are these things going to, that's a trade-off. The more revenue you reduce and the more expenditure you increase, you're likely to get into the British situation. Thank
you, Minister. As I said, honorable members, we can still take these issues with with Treasury when they come before us. But let me take this opportunity to thank the Minister, Acting DG, Mr. Sishi, and the whole team. Also thank the Commissioner SARS, all of you honorable members on the platform, our support staff who have made this possible, that we engage with the Minister. Thank you very much, Minister. You are excused. Let's go to the next agenda item. Are there any announcements from the secretaries of the committees? Let me start with NCOP, select committees. Any announcements from your side?
Not necessarily, except to indicate that the next meeting is on Tuesday. The committees will be briefed by PPO and FFC on the MTBPS chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Alan, anything from you?
Yes, Chair. Standing Committee on Finance meeting tomorrow morning. It's a response by National Treasury to submissions on the General Laws Amendment Bill from 9 to 12. I will be sending out the link in the next hour.
Thank you so much. Darren, anything from your side? Darren? Any announcements? You may be struggling with your...
It might happen, Chair, that Darren is struggling because we have load shedding this side, Chair.
Okay.
Yeah, but I'm sure the issue of next week meeting is also applicable to his committee, Chair.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Honorable members and everybody, this brings us to the end of this meeting until we meet next week. Thank you very much. The meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.